And it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to be opening the day. Just last night there was a reception for some of the speakers and organizers, and I could already tell it's just such an amazing group of people and women here today. An amazing lineup ahead of us. So I'm just really excited for what's for the rest of today, but also just really impressed with all of the organizing committee. I know we gave a round of applause to them earlier today, but just another round of applause because they just did a fantastic job at this event. I was saying I've spoken at a couple of other conferences this year, and including South by Southwest, and this was actually the most organizing committee that I've ever had to work with. So it's been such a pleasure, so thank you very much. I was also really excited about the theme of building bridges. I thought that was a really nice theme because it's actually pretty core and central to what we do as UX professionals. A lot of what we do is really trying to bridge what the user needs to our products, and then also convey that back to our product teams. So I was really excited to be able to kind of share some lessons that I've learned through my time at Google and to what we do here today. So a little bit about me. You heard a little bit about me already, but I lead right now a global research team for Google's core products across Search, Assistant, and News. And so we're based in several other countries, some emerging markets, some US, of course, and we do a lot of work both on the early needs identification and also kind of post-launch work. I would say maybe I'm a lifelong fan of technology or creating. And I wasn't coding at that time, but I did really like the making, which I was really pleased I could get into a field like UX and be exposed to design. And because, I mean, really look at that floppy disk. It's impeccable if you remember what they look like. And also another fun fact, this year is actually Google's 20th birthday. So Search turned 20, and I've been at Google for 13 of those years. And then also the Assistant, another product I work on, turned 2. So it's actually really fascinating to be kind of at this nexus of the company where we are working with such an established product and then also such a new product, working with assistive technology and voice and all of that. So, so overall, so it's a great time. I did my master's and PhD as well. I actually interned at Google during my PhD, and was so excited that I was like, whoa, I don't need this PhD anymore. I quit and then worked at Google, and then ended up finishing part-time because I was almost done anyway. But yeah, so I'm happy to share a little bit more. We have a lot of time for questions at the end. If you have questions around how Google has grown or growth or anything like that, I'm happy to chat more about it. But so 5 lessons learned, I think. We'll go right into them, but I just wanted to share kind of a spectrum of both kind of the work we do as UXers, then also kind of the evolution of the field of UX. Cool. So the first point, embedding end-to-end with product teams. This probably doesn't seem really novel. It probably seems quite intuitive today, but it actually wasn't always the way things worked at Google, and especially when I got into the field of UX, this wasn't quite the way we're operating just yet. I'm reminded of this quote I like by designer Charles Eames. The role of designer is a very good, thoughtful host, anticipating the needs of his guest. And I think about that a lot, both in terms of what we do as researchers and enabling our users to feel comfortable and making sure that we're addressing their needs, but then also as professionals. How are we best able to understand the needs of our guests to our products, and how can we convey that back to our teams? When I started at Google, we were much more of a service model. In fact, when I started, we weren't called researchers, we were called usability analysts. And a few years into the job that changed. But we were researchers and designers, and there was like maybe 6 of us for all of Google. And back then, yes, it was a lot smaller, but we still had a diverse product space. Like we still had Blogger, we had Picasa, which is now Google Photos. There was ads and search, so it was a variety of things. So one week I'd work on one thing, another week the next. And we were quite a service model, and similar with design. I mean, if you can imagine, when you're working on such a different range of stuff, you don't have the ability to really get to know the product. You don't understand the roadmap as well, the technical constraints, and the needs. And so you are a bit more limited in terms of what you can do and the impact that you can have. So fast forward to Google today, we're a ton of disciplines in UX. And so our teams are a lot bigger now. Like you heard, my team just for search assistant news across that space, we're over 50, 60 folks. And so like what we've also done is specialized across functions. And so this enables us to actually go in deep. So not only designers, when we were first hired at Google, you all had to code and pass a programming test, and you had to be able to do a bunch of stuff. And in fact, all the reports I wrote for Google were all written in like HTML and CSS on our company website and whatever it was. So, but now we have visual designers. We're investing in different crafts of design, motion designers, especially now with assistant conversational designers is something that's evolved that we've had to really develop. Quantitative, qualitative researchers. But really looking at like how we want to build out our specialties, but then also enable us to kind of go deep end to end in our products. And if we can't cover everything, then we just really would prefer not to cover it, and then instead just be able to go in embedding with teams. Kind of along this process, I like the notion of discover, develop, and evolve. Because with evolving, you're not just launching a product, but you're actually kind of helping to evolve the org culture and practice, bringing empathy back to the product teams, helping to reflect on what we launched, did it actually work? And so now when we do work now, we really try to focus on these stages of development and making sure we can help with both identifying the product needs, figuring out the right appropriate ways to build it, and then looking at some of the work effects. Cool. Second point, this point is kind of circular, right? Theater creates reality, and you can turn reality into theater. And I think this is actually a lot of what we've ended up doing a little bit with research. And don't get me wrong, I'm as rigorous as anybody in my like really hardcore methods, but there is quite a lot of theater in terms of what we need to do just to help messages resonate back to our product teams and help them really understand the points we're trying to get across. This is an example, this is a photo from an immersion study we did. Immersion studies, we take product teams, designers, product managers, engineers out with us to a new context where we're trying to learn something new. This one is in India. This is the Maps team. You can probably spot the Googlers in this picture. And they were trying to understand things about commute in India. And so, we do things like say, okay, you want to understand commute? Why don't you try to use Google Maps with public transportation and get around Calcutta? See how that goes. And so we do things like that. This is one photo from that. But I'm also reminded of this quote from Irving Goffman, who's was a sociologist. And all the world is not, of course, a stage, but the crucial ways in which it isn't are not easy to specify. And he did a lot of work about presentation of self in everyday life and kind of how we represent ourselves back to others. And there's always a little bit of theater in terms of how we're trying to portray ourselves. And similarly, I do feel like the craft of both research and UX, there is a little bit of that in terms of what theater and story we're trying to create and give back. So if you think about this is where we may have done studies like when I first started at Google, like usability lab, it's on campus. If you were paying to go to a theater, would you pay to go to this performance? Probably not. And it's fine for some things, don't get me wrong. Like if you're doing basic usability studies, this setup is okay. But then also think about the quote from Eames before. If the users are guests and they're coming into the space, sitting at this white table with kind of IKEA paintings on the wall and a camera on the, staring right at you, how comfortable are they going to be? And so this kind of, as we've evolved the practice of what we do, we've also evolved a lot about our infrastructure and capabilities to do that. Right? It's not just evolving our methods, but we have to really adapt kind of our basic infrastructure too. The other thing that's notable here about these labs is for a long time, a lot of Google's researchers were based in Mountain View, California, which if you don't know, it's like a little town, city south of San Francisco with minimal public transportation access. And in order to go to one of those usability labs during the middle of the day, during the middle of the week, you have to be able to get a car and you have to drive there. And so it's really not in terms of accessible or diverse in terms of who we can get. It's not quite always reaching who we want to. So the other thing about Google is that we've always had like haircut vans. You could show up to Google and there'd be like a van to change your oil or cut your hair and go to the dentist on campus. So I told my boss one year, I said, you know what, we have all these vans coming to Google. Why don't we get a van and put a lab inside of it and drive it across the country? And I thought he was going to laugh. He was like, sure, that sounds great. So we did. so, so we bought this van. We retrofitted it actually with this company in Brooklyn who does this for corporate companies as a living. I guess a lot of people, not with usability labs, but anyway. So this has actually helped us. This is kind of one next step in terms of taking that usability lab, but going to where we need to go. We have driven this, actually just last week, this was in an apple orchard in northern Pennsylvania, doing some research there. But it actually enables us to go with our product teams into areas we might not be able to reach otherwise. My team does a lot of research on news because we build news products. And so we were able to go, and target different locations. Especially, we did stuff with, primaries around election time in areas like in Texas, outside of California, in New York, North Carolina, areas that our product teams wouldn't always be able to reach, but where it's actually important to get a diverse sense of people that we're talking to who will ultimately be using our products, and just making sure that we're actually can be as representative as possible for all user needs. And also it reaches people where they are. So they don't have to drive to Google, but you can get people in a park, and you can get people, and this was actually a great thing for shopkeepers. For Maps, we do a lot of work with merchants, small business owners. You just drive up to their strip mall, park outside of it. They can come out during their lunch break, whereas they could never drive and take the time off to come to Google. So it's enabled us to reach a much broader diversity of participants, which is actually pretty important for us for what we're doing. Even more than that, though, we do also do a lot of kind of what we call immersion studies for markets that we're planning to go to or dive into, whether that's in Nigeria, whether Indonesia, India. A lot of these photos are from India. This is team members on Maps who we sent around on public transportation in India, trying to get around using only Google Maps and public transport. But another photo there, we had a product manager who really wanted to build the best cricket experience for Google search in India. And if you know, when you search for football or basketball scores in the US on Google, you get kind of updates and game times. And we really wanted to see what was the equivalent for cricket in India. So we went there and see everybody playing cricket in the street during cricket season and things like that. As well as looking at, how are people using mobile phones, especially during a commute. This one is particularly precarious and dangerous, I feel. No helmet, no hands on the motorbike, but seeing how people are, addicted to technology, phones, using them everywhere. But this is actually helpful. It's helpful for a number of things. I mean, these shared experiences not only give you a better understanding about our users and who they are and who we're building for, but it also strengthens relationships back to the teams that you're working with day to day. So you're taking some time outside of work just to be a little creative, do something a little different, really does help quite a lot in terms of building bridges, getting to know people as people outside of the office, and having that shared experience, going through, especially the shared hardship of trying to navigate around public transportation in India, brings people closer together. But besides that, but it generally has enabled people to just kind of take the time and be a little bit more creative about what we're trying to solve for. Our research van was actually in Kansas just last week or the week before, too. So that's a recent picture from that. But it's also led to apps and experiences that are better tailored to the diverse user needs that we're trying to solve for. So a lot of the work we did in India, discovered things, input's a challenge, right? When literacy can be a challenge. People actually don't know what Google can do. We have a blank search box. And for people coming online for the first time, what's behind there? What should I even bother looking for? And so there's a lot of these questions that, we discovered through doing a lot of this international work. And so last year, I believe, or a year and a half ago, we launched Google Go and Maps Go, which are two apps built specifically for emerging markets. This is Google Go here, and you can see we don't put the search boxes front and center there. We make tapping and affordance much more accessible, where if typing is a barrier and it's a constraint and difficult, then we want to make sure that you can tap and get to the things you need, whether it's GIFs, images, YouTube. You can search. We even have apps to like ClickBuzz, popular things that we know are in that market. And just making it a little bit more easy and tailored to people coming online and addressing their needs. To the other point about theater, like we also do a lot of things to bring teams together on campus, right? Because not everybody can go and do a research trip. But we also do shared learnings. Like this is a recent expo we had where we just have posters up with kind of insights that we've gotten across the board, and we have you know, food and drinks. But you can see it's pretty packed, right? And it's not just you know, people just reading the insights, but it's also the conversations that are created with each other and the conversations you create kind of about the insights that you're learning about our users. Just having, even this is just like 2 hours outside of the day, it's time where people are getting away from their desks and coming into a context that's a little bit different so you can talk and engage in a different way. So again, all these things I found help to build bridges with the people that we work with on a day-to-day basis just by kind of just changing the pace a little bit, exposing them to new information in a different way. It sparks a different kind of conversation that you wouldn't have already had. And then this one, I'll just go quick here. We had, well actually this is when we redesigned our Google logo and kind of look and feel a couple years ago. And when we did that, we had this, this example is about like how prototypes actually help make things real for execs. So you see those 4 dots up there. So we had these 4 dots, and there's like a little animation where they turn into bars, where it's like listening and doing voice search. And then we're like, and then trust us, these dots that turn into bars then turn into the letters Google. And we had execs like, what are you talking about? And so I'll just play this quickly. If I could, I just play this here? So you can see there's like, it's like listening, and then it turns into Google. So this was actually really helpful. It seems super basic, right? But it was actually really helpful just when we presented it to our CEO. We put it in his hand, and we're like, okay, try a search. This is what it's going to look like. See that. So this actually happens. We've done this for a number of things, but prototypes are actually super successful. Once you have an idea that you want to make real, it's been a really powerful way for us to actually help convey things. And it doesn't take as much time as engineering something and building it into launch. Let me go ahead. Let me see how to go to the next slide. There. Okay. I think we're good. All right. The next point's pretty related to the last one, but storytelling does matter. Kipling, if history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. And similarly, in terms of our work, both as designers, as we're conveying our ideas back to our product teams, but also as researchers as well, and in any UX professional really, trying to convey what the user needs back into the product, it does really help when we think about the user journey and the story behind that. The challenging thing there is that not everybody's trained in how to tell stories well. Like, as researchers, we're trained in the art of research. Like, my PhD didn't cover at all how to effectively convey something. It told me how to, how to get statistically significant results, report it out, publish it in a journal, right? And it's very dry, very boring. And so that type of work is not what's actually going to sell, especially like a very time-poor executive who has just a couple minutes to hear the key points and make a decision. It's not going to quite land. And so we've actually invested quite a lot over the past few years, and I know it may sound basic, but just in different ways to make kind of this effective and persuasive communication just much easier across the organization. So you don't have to learn a ton of things. We established a communication and video design team, just 2 people, but it actually quite helped a lot in terms of just creating templates for things. So we have basic templates for decks, reports, emails, just basic things so that you don't have to worry about what should this look like or that look like. You can just kind of plug your content in. And then templates for posters, presentations, like those expos we do, we can work with the team and just have some basic kind of stock templates to use so we don't have to recreate everything all the time. Then it also helps create kind of some brand consistency across the board, especially if we have a more consistent look and feel across all of our findings. We've also done courses like field photography, when you're, what should you look for when you're doing video, when you're out in Indonesia, how do you really capture what we want to capture and bring back. Writing, storytelling, all of these types of things. And again, it sounds pretty basic, but these are all different ways that we've been trying to experiment with just conveying stuff for audience. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to affect the best change possible in our products, and work with our product teams to say this is what the user needs are, and this would be a really successful product with that. So we've done a lot with video. How can video be effective at telling a story, showcasing things? The same VPs that I've worked with at Google 13 years ago who were all about, I mean, then search was a bit different, right? It was literally just like 10 blue links on a search page. But the executives there who just really cared about how fast is our page loading, now are like, wait, can we watch that user video? Wait, can you play it again? And it's just been really great to see, especially as our product space has gotten so much more diverse, the desire to engage and see our users interact in these ways. The other thing that with storytelling I like to think a lot about is how we broaden the context, because I think it is pretty easy for us to get kind of narrow focused in on the thing that we're working on. Like if I'm a researcher on Google Photos, I can say, you know what, here's how people are using Google Photos, here's what's happening, here's what's good, what's not. And it's sometimes easy for me to miss what's happening. How else are people doing photo sharing, photo saving, photo editing elsewhere, right? There's tons of other products out there. And so keeping a pulse on the external landscape is actually super important for being able to effectively tell that story, especially to execs who want to know how their stuff fits into the bigger picture. And one example that I've recently liked is because it's more timely, is around like voice search and digital assistants. A lot of stats that we see around this now are very US-centric, very first world. Like over 50% of Americans have used voice on a mobile phone. About a third of people have a smart speaker at home. And then 40% of the people who have a smart speaker say it's essential. Right, so great trends about assistants and these devices. But it also misses a large portion of the world. And so one of the things that we do know, its voice is empowering, from all of the research, a whole new segment of international users. Things where input was a challenge previously, or literacy was a challenge, where technology, people getting a phone for the first time, there are some barriers to that, especially as we've seen such a rise of 4G feature phones. They basically, if you remember your feature phones, you basically type using the numbers on your keypad, right, T9, and so it's not very easy to type. And so voice is actually a much easier form of input for people. And we're actually seeing things like it's leveling the playing field for some of those people new to technology. Just pulling in some external statistics, we look at there's almost a 20% gap between men and women literacy rates in India. And we know that a lot of women in emerging markets end up sharing phones because they can't afford them, or they're not able to type and search for something that they want. And so this could actually be hugely empowering for people in these situations where they don't necessarily have to share phones and worry about privacy, or they don't have to ask a family member to just search something for them, where we might have more opportunities. So again, that's just one example, but like being able to take our work into sort of the broader context, or just looking at some of the external trends and helping to tell the story that way. Great. Frameworks is another piece that I think is pretty important for us as we go through, and just in terms of creating a shared baseline and understanding between the people we work with in our craft. So this is a photo from the material design spec, that's Google's design spec that we publish. But it's actually been really helpful in a number of ways. So we have the material design framework now, which is actually quite helpful to basically just present an objective foundation of how our design should be looking across our products. Look and feel, consistency for our users. Sure, it sounds super basic, but there was actually many reviews that I remember where we would have executives say, well, how about this color? Well, maybe you should just indent this thing just a little bit more. And there was like an engineering VP shouldn't be having those types of conversations, right? We should leave that to the UX team, because there's much more substantial product conversations that we could have. And also you don't want to create something that's inconsistent with what another product or feature does. So we've actually found that beyond just creating a more consistent look and feel for design across Google, it's actually had the effect of helping our execs focus less on some of the minutia of design, but actually a little bit more on kind of the substance of what we're trying to convey and how we're doing that. This has been, it takes away some of that objectivity. Because I think for some people who are not trained in UX, it can seem like, oh, this is a subjective thing, it's an opinion, I have an opinion on this, why don't we just do that? But having that kind of shared baseline just helps to help people understand why and how we're making some of the choices we're making. Similar for research, we do like to have some standard measures for research and joint measures of success. Like as we're building our products, it's knowing what is success at the end of the day is an important conversation to have with the people you're working with, and even having some frameworks for which to apply from and pull from to develop that is important. So we use, one example is the HEART framework, and I'll go through these letters, but it's actually been helpful just in terms of creating kind of a shared repository. We might not use every single metric for every single product, right? That's not necessarily the point, but the point's which to have like sort of some baseline framework to draw from which to have that conversation and engage with your product teams. So happiness, this is essentially kind of these moments of delight or satisfaction with your product. And you can measure happiness in a way it's unique to your product. Like historically at Google, we've done a lot of in-product surveys, and so we've tracked satisfaction over time. And that's been really useful as a measure over time, not necessarily the absolute measure, but actually to be able to see, okay, we launched this change and maybe happiness took a dip and then it got better again. And so being able to track that, or also maybe relative to other products that we do. But also now we're trying to look at things like time well spent. So not only is happiness satisfaction, but do you feel that the time you spent using our product was actually worthwhile? We're also trying to look at more measures of delight. So happiness is something that you can look at in a couple of different ways if you're able to measure that in product or post after people use your product. And then there's also just a ton of free data. If you don't have the ability to do anything in product or survey people afterwards, like looking at app reviews, press reviews, product reviews, there's tons of feedback that people are actually, customer reports, feedback. A lot of people are giving this stuff for free. And so it just takes a little bit of time to go through it, but it can be a really helpful source of kind of just the overall sentiment of how people are using your product. Engagement, a pretty basic one is just time spent and how people, and what they're doing in your product. So we do a lot of logging for this. How engaged are people? How much time are they spending? How many features are they using? How many things are they doing? But also you can look at a lot of third-party reports. Like when we do some of the storytelling to look at the bigger picture, we look at a lot of external reports in terms of, hey, how are people, what other apps are people using? What's the engagement like on these apps versus those apps? And what's driving this, just to be able to track trends at a little broader level. And then on a qualitative way, we also do, we've done some fun things like breakup letters and love letters. This actually we do a lot, but we have the research van because we tend to get like a lineup of people that are curious about what the van is, and so we have a lot of pen and paper activities outside. And so some of them we do, it's like say you had to write either a love letter or breakup letter to your favorite Google product or your favorite, or pick a product in general, and would you want to write a love letter or breakup letter to it? And they actually get really interesting things. It sounds really cheesy, but people are quite kind of creative when they write some of these things, and they say, you know what, we have to break up, you're just unreliable, you're never there when I need you, and so you can also kind of get a sense there of people's reactions to what you're building there. Adoption, this is essentially the pace of uptake. How quickly are people picking up your product and using it over time? Again, this is something you can do through in-product logs or keeping a pulse on external trends. We have the R and the T left. Retention, so do users come back to your product? We have a phrase that we use at Google, the toothbrush test. You might brush your teeth twice a day. So you come back to your toothbrush like a couple times a day, and so we'd like to think: is your product something that people want to come back to multiple times a day, or whatever frequency is right for you? But is it something that you can kind of build in that habit and be appropriate for use there? So we look at things like in product analysis, how are people using our product? But we've also done a lot of work like with diary studies. When we launch new products for the first time before it's released, we ask people to use it for an extended period of time, and what was their experience like using it? Did they come back to it? Did they just forget about it and then go back to their other things, or could they actually incorporate it into their habits? And then lastly, of the HEART task success, This is essentially, are people able to do what you want them to do on your product? Like, are we able to complete those core journeys that we had envisioned? And so we do that a lot qualitatively, observing people, usability. We can certainly look at some task success in the logs, but you don't get as much of the richness as if you watch some people as well, right? Your metrics don't always are able to convey how frustrated someone might be or how they make excuses for themselves. Oh, I just don't know how to do this yet. Well, actually, you know what? You should just be able to do it, and that's a product failing. But you see a lot of times where people put the blame back on technology on themselves rather than on the technology. So again, this heart metric is just one way, like from a research point of view, we can kind of build a shared baseline and understanding across our product teams for what metrics might be important and how we might want to be looking at the health and success. Then the last thing I do want to talk about is a little bit more about the team and kind of a philosophy towards hiring and hiring towards what's next and what we want to be able to do. So I thought a lot about that, like with the research team itself, because when I started at Google, everybody was kind of like me. We had PhDs. I had never heard of user experience. I didn't know this thing existed, and but I knew I didn't really want to be in academia. So then I actually, when I interned at Google, I was in a completely different field. I was doing like search quality, and then I happened to meet the two researchers at the time. There was only two in 2004 who were doing the usability analysis, and so I got into that and met them, met the designers, and really learned everything I needed to learn through them on the job, things like that. But as Google's grown, I think it's important that, and a lot of the pedigree, most of the people had, like a lot of the researchers were from academic backgrounds, which brings a certain bent to it. But especially as our company has evolved and our products have evolved and the needs have evolved, like we can't keep doing that because it doesn't quite make sense and it's not going to build the right team. So thinking about what diverse backgrounds do we want to have, like diversity comes from anywhere, but diversity in thought is actually super important, especially as we're like for anybody, but especially for Google, as our products are in so many different countries, different languages, people are exposed with different backgrounds coming online for the first time. Like, how are we presenting Google to them? A lot of these things are really critical questions, which are not really kind of scientific academic questions. We want to do a lot more ethnographic work, build up some of the quantitative capabilities as well. And so definitely started doing that. Conversation design is also a really interesting one as assistant and voice technologies become much more common. Like we used to have the same standard designer several years ago looking at voice interactions as looked at like, interaction design on a website or a mobile device. And so now we've evolved that into a discipline of conversation designer. So people who are trained in linguistics understand kind of the flows of conversation, how things should go, like how conversation and exchanges go, what's the appropriate inflection for voice, are there certain things we can do by understanding frustration? There's a lot of things that we're trying to do now there, and so we've developed certain disciplines and new disciplines at Google as well, just to keep up with our products and kind of how we want to evolve. So I think for that, it's just the main thing about where do you see your team, your company next, and where are some of the gaps? Because ultimately, we are all working together as a team, and we want to be able to learn. I want my team to be able to learn from each other as best they can, and so you're learning when people are different from you and come from different backgrounds. So that's another thing that I'm pretty passionate about now. So just a quick recap. These were kind of the five lessons learned through time at Google. And I did want to leave it a bit of time. I guess we have like 15 minutes for questions. So yeah, I wanted to open it up and hear from all of you. So thank you. Yes, one question. We have mics here. There's mics there.
What kind of hurdles did you encounter as a female in Silicon Valley, especially like 13 years ago?
Yeah, good question. So I guess there is definitely not very many females, at least when I started at Google. I think there would be, I think on a couple of different levels. Right? One, You don't always notice it, but when you're the only female in a room, you feel different. I at least feel differently when I'm the only woman in the room, because you feel different, right? Versus being with like other women or people around. And then certainly, it's like with any case of diversity, I guess, too. But it's overcoming both like a comfort level and that level, I think, in terms of this is what it's like. But then also just the way of interacting. A lot of especially at Google, we hire a ton of really smart people. And so it can be, a lot of people have their opinions and ideas. And I would always think, oh, wow, their idea and their opinion must be super well formed. They must have thought about this really carefully and know this subject matter expert. Especially like I thought at the time when I was working on a whole bunch of different products. I was like, oh, they just must know more than me about this thing. But it's never the case, right? And so overcoming that too, it's like, yes, everybody's just making stuff up on the fly too. And so my opinion is just as valid as everybody else's. So I would say that is another big thing where you have to just be very conscious of, because it's quite easy to think that, yeah, okay, maybe somebody's more well-versed in this, but the truth is, like, I'm more well-versed in other areas that they don't know, and you know way more than somebody else knows about this, so we all come with a different perspective, and I think also then, now that I've gone into leadership roles at Google, just being conscious of also calling out people that have those different perspectives, because it's so easy, I think, for people who are maybe running a meeting to not, be cognizant or pay attention to that. Yeah, and then I think when I first started at Google, there's always there wasn't many women, so you'd always have an engineer saying, oh, you want to go to lunch? And then they treat it like a date, which is ridiculous, right? So I'm like, I thought we were just going to lunch as a colleague at the Google campus, which is free, right outside the building. What's happening here? So I think there's also issues like that too. I don't experience that anymore at all, but it's fine. But I think as a younger woman in Silicon Valley, I did. Go ahead.
Could you speak a little bit more to the strengths of specialization, like you said at the end of your talk? So I know I've had a few conversations with designers who are doing both research and UX, or who are doing both interaction design and visual design. So what are the strengths of specialization?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I do feel like doing a little bit of multiple things actually helps you in your career, and whether that's the right thing like long term, or whether that's, not everybody has the luxury to have a specialist for each, because maybe that's not needed all the time. So I do want to be quite conscious and aware of that. And also you do learn a lot, like if you're a designer and you do your own kind of, interact with users, you learn a lot that way too. So I'm not saying like specialization is the only way, but it has enabled us to really kind of refine the craft. Like the org that I'm in right now, we're, around like maybe 400 UXers, and so we specialize by discipline. So I run the research team. There's someone who runs the interaction design team, someone who runs the visual design team, and so someone who runs the motion design team, someone who runs the UX engineering. So it's a bit more of a matrixed organization, which can be a little bit more complex because you kind of have to work across boundaries, but it actually also enables us to invest a little bit more in the craft and how we want to evolve some things. Especially I find this is helpful, like when mentoring more people like early in their career, because if I had come in early in my career and someone who didn't know anything about research was my manager or my mentor kind of helping me, I don't know that I would have been as creative or explored a number of different options and things as I did with my, the experience that I had. And so I think at least the advantage I see is that it helps kind of cultivate more of a creativity and investment in the craft of the discipline. Because it really, like, a company's all about craft and culture, I feel like, right? What's the culture you're creating and what are you enabling people to do? So if you don't have the ability to specialize and kind of build out those different functions, I think just being attentive to like how you want to invest in the craft in certain ways and have a little bit of time that's maybe outside of the core product focus to invest in that.
Hi. How is your team specifically dealing with the problems of user trust in the digital space?
Yeah, that's a great question. So trust, how are we dealing with user trust? I think trust has been, it's been in the press a lot, it's been in the news a lot, especially with a lot of the tech companies, both data we collect, what we do with data, how the information we convey back to users. And so that's definitely been a big research topic. I have a few researchers working on things like trust and better understanding that. And then certainly a lot of the, Google cares about it very much, just because especially because something like search ranking is something that's actually a little bit hard to explain. And when you try to explain it, people just feel like you're almost making excuses, And then people also tend to think like, oh, Google should be really smart about stuff. So if Google makes a mistake, it's almost easier for people to sometimes interpret like a malicious intent, right? So looking at some of these, we've been looking at a lot of perception around things like that, like almost like folk theories. If something doesn't work with Google, what are public perceptions around that, and how can we better address that? So we started a research track around that, and we're looking at, are there things we should do in product? Are there ways we can better help kind of explain whether it's how Google works or things like that? So.
I'm interested in that slide you had with all the different teams at Google.
Yeah.
And specifically, beyond the more obvious ones, I was wondering what the specific key differences between the UX team or the interaction team and the UX lead team at Google specifically, what do they do?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. The UX engineering team, there are people who do a lot of both UX tools for us, as well across the company, as well as prototypes. So a lot of the people on the UX engineering team have computers, are much more fluent in software engineering or prototyping techniques than an average designer, who will be basically in interaction looking at the flows, visual designer kind of looking at look and feel and overall aesthetic. So the other thing that's interesting about the UX engineering discipline that we built up is also because of how software engineering works at Google. Software engineering works, we have one software engineering ladder, and you have to pass 6 interviews about back-end coding, about databases, about infrastructure, and maybe they ask you a little bit about front end, but not really. And so we found that it's actually hard for us with the standard software engineering hiring criteria, which they're looking to change, to really get the front end talent that we need to look at and build out some of the designs and the interactions that we've been looking for. So UX engineering is also a way to get people also proficient in iOS, right? People who know iOS really well might not know the full tech stack, and so just being able to get a broader diversity of folks. So frequently the UX engineers can translate between kind of design and production and help the engineering team figure out, hey, how do we want some of these animations, transitions to get baked into product if we don't have the other technical, they're kind of like technical advisors too, in addition to the prototypes that we use for studies, to show to execs, things like that.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So how do you make sure the massive data you get from worldwide get to the 400 UXers in different many professions, and how do you make sure they get the things that they don't see?
Yeah, good question. So we do a lot of the things that I showed you. We have expos. When it's somebody who's working on a specific product area, we definitely do presentations and reports and share-outs and conversations directly with that team. We also do a weekly email for basically the entire organization with kind of the key insights that we learned about, the research that we did last week. And so that kind of also is a baseline to keep people in the loop. But it's an important question, and one that we're actually still thinking about. It's how to really make people accountable. Because we'll have product teams that say, you know what, I really want to understand what's going on here in India in this context. And then they come back to Mountain View, and then they're like, oh, right, yeah, that was really important, but geez, yeah, it's easy to forget about it. And so we definitely want to build up a better practice of keeping people accountable as well. Even if they are aware of the insight, when things are hard to do, it's sometimes easier to put those aside. But if they can make a huge difference, that's one of the things we're really trying to kind of push and invest in.
Thank you. Great presentation. As a leader in UX and technology, how do you encourage other females to grow and grow their career and then grow into leadership and kind of continue doing what you do?
Yeah. There's always more to do, right? I think whenever, when you say that question, I'm like, yeah, I should be doing this, this, and that. But I like to do, mentoring, across the company. I also just continue talks like this. Also within my own team, like we do have, I think we're pretty good on the gender ratio, but like just continuing to invest in people, because I also find that, oftentimes women aren't asking as directly for things, or being as forceful about where they want a career to go, or saying, it's okay. And so also just pushing a little bit, where it's appropriate. Not everybody, needs to be pushed or should be, but I think just looking out for people that may be quieter or have quieter styles of leadership to engage. Especially and then in meetings, just little things like in meetings, like I know when there's often, there can be meetings where, it can be a very male-dominated conversation, and maybe women are trying to present or speak up, but it's hard to get a word in because some people are just really loud, and you just you're trying to wait for a pause, but then everybody else interjects. And so just being able to, at those times, say, like, I think, Emily was trying to say something. Can we just give her a chance? She's been, so things like that, where just, like, in the course of every day, besides, like, events and mentoring, just doing a little bit more of that, like, on a day-to-day basis. Yeah.
Hi, you talked about the voice interfaces bridging the gap between the literacy. So I just want to know how you do the design and research when you talk about like designing the user flow for voice interfaces, considering all the different languages worldwide and cultures.
So some of that is, we still have some technical constraints. Like our Google's like language recognition and text-to-speech, we're getting better in multiple languages, but we still found that it's not always as good. I think a few years ago, a researcher on my team was from India, and he's like, have you heard the Google talkback in India? He's like, have you seen The Simpsons? And it sounds like a Simpsons character like trying to speak back to me. And he's like, we need to fix something. So there's certainly like ways to go there, and so we do a lot of in-country work, or native language speakers and things like that, to really understand, not only are the words right, but like how does it actually sound and feel back. So we're doing that with the language model. And it's tough as we've looked at things like personality, like Siri and Alexa have a ton of personality, you can say jokes or whatever, but we want to make sure that we do this in an appropriate way that can scale globally as well. And then a lot of the in-country work would help. Like some of my team is based in India, so we do a lot of research there, whether it's in Hindi or Bengali, things like that.
What's the process for scaling something globally?
Like a product, a team, or?
Yeah, like a product or a new feature.
Yeah. Great, 5 minutes. Okay, so a lot of our products, with the exception of some of the ones I showed, I think because Google's historically been, hey, we'll try things in the US first and then we'll scale. And then it's usually been like, hey, let's change, we'll put things in different, we'll just change the language, right? And then you run into things like in German, strings are a lot longer, and so they don't fit in the button that you designed, right? So we've run into, like, those are a lot of the basic things we've done with just core internationalization. But I think a lot of the things now that we're trying to deal with, we want to build market-specific solutions first, especially for emerging markets, whether it's things like payments, whether it's things like file sharing, photo sharing, helping there, just better understanding the unique needs there. Even the Europe market, very different from the US in terms of trust and privacy and attitudes there. So we are trying to do much more country-specific stuff by better understanding the market specifically.
So Google ended support recently for a few of the big products that were once big headlining products, Google Plus, Inbox. What kind of research and process goes into that, and saying we'll no longer iterate on it and just shutting it down?
Good question. Yeah, I used to work on Google Plus. We did a lot of research on Google Plus. We I think without going into maybe the challenges of the product, I think looking at what core user need are we satisfying? So for a product like that, we actually found enterprise market is actually using Google Plus quite a lot because it's really easy for companies to do that kind of stuff internally. And that was a much bigger use case, longer term for us than kind of the consumer platform. So that's when where we pivoted the business shift. So it's not like the product was completely thrown away, but yes, the consumer side of it was. So I think when we do a lot of the research there, then it's just tracking some of the same metrics, like what's our engagement like? What's our adoption like? Is that slowing down? Is it worth keeping? Like, should we keep, and then there's questions around, do we put it in maintenance mode or do we turn it off? Like, what's the relative investment? If we can't give users a great experience, if we have only a couple people in maintenance mode, is it better to turn off? So I think those are some of the considerations that go into some of those decisions.
As you moved into leadership roles, how has that changed the nature and frequency of your interaction with the users? And in general, how do you see like the structure of a big company being related to user-centered design practices?
Yeah, no, it's a good question because I don't talk to users nearly on the weekly, daily basis that I used to, right? So a lot of it now is what I get from my team, and so I do try to read, like when I send out the weekly emails of what we do, but I do read everything. And I am curious about it, look at the videos, some of the relevant reports. So I do try to stay in touch. And then also talking with the team too, because you can also just get a sense from talking to someone who observed something like, what was the key thing that stood out to you? And just kind of knowing some of these salient things across the team is just really helpful, just to also have in mind for things we should push on or be investing in down the line. So, and I do try to get out. I didn't go on the research van trip this year. I did last year and the year before. But also like I was in Egypt earlier this year for one of the studies we did to understand Middle East, and Arabic markets. So I do try to engage and do these things as well. But it's not with the frequency I used to, so try to get it from my team. Yeah, go. There's a question there. Where?
Kind of here first.
Thanks, that was a great presentation. I was wondering if you had any advice for leaner research teams.
So leaner research teams. Yeah. Look, I do think a lot of the same things can apply, just done in a little scrappier way. Like you can still do things like get your team engaged in research, and yes, you don't have to buy a whole van, right? We set up a picnic table outside in some spots too, and kind of get the same feedback like in a park or something like that. But then also just having things like just like events at work, with user feedback, some opportunities, posters, things for the team to understand. The rationale behind some of the design decisions, research decisions. I think just even some of those things, like maybe take a couple hours out of the day. It's some work to prep for, but like the team can actually rally behind it and doing that preparation for it. And when it's a pretty engaged and participatory event, it does bring up a lot of the interest across the board. All right, it looks like we're about done. So with time. So thank you so much. I really appreciate all the questions. Thank you. I'll be around during breaks if you have any more questions for me. Happy to chat more. So thank you.